Good evening from Rocky Mountain PBS. I'm Cynthia Hessin. This is Colorado's State of Mind. This week came the discovery of a 9th fatality from last month's severe flooding in Colorado when the body of a 60-year-old Larimer County woman, Patricia Goodwine, was found in debris west of Loveland. And on Wednesday, the Colorado legislature formed a 12-member bipartisan committee to study short-term relief and long-term planning for flood recovery in the future. The unknown, of course, is when or whether the state might see such devastating floods again. Was this a 100-year event, a 1,000-year event? We begin with an iNews report from Joe Mahoney, Carrie Saldo, and Laura Frank, reviewing the disaster and what conclusions scientists in the state are drawing.
On June 11, 2013, Colorado's severe drought season erupted in the most destructive wildfire in state history. 2 people died and more than 500 homes were destroyed as flames engulfed 22 square miles of the state's Black Forest region. Exactly 3 months later, September 11th, the skies opened along the Front Range of the Rocky Mountains. Rain fell like no one in Colorado had ever seen it fall before. More than a foot of rain in some places.
We are indeed getting some new information about some of the flooding that's going on, especially up in the Boulder area.
But, this storm is stretching all the way down into Colorado Springs, where we were just learning that a body was recovered this morning at South Nevada 920.
At least 8 people died. Nearly 2,000 homes were destroyed and 16,000 more damaged as flooding inundated an area nearly the size of Connecticut.
So what we saw in this particular flood event is the rainfall amounts were truly unprecedented and have been estimated to be a 1,000-year return interval. As we get more moisture in a warmer atmosphere, warmer air could hold more moisture, we could have longer periods of time that it doesn't rain because the atmosphere is holding all this moisture. That increases the drought or the dry spells. But what climate change appears to be doing is increasing the odds or the chances of this kind of flood happening. As the world warms and the oceans warm, there's more water vapor in the atmosphere. So when the natural factors come together, that natural variability, there's more moisture available for more rain. One of the problems that people have wrapping their heads around this is what we're talking about with something like Hurricane Sandy or the 2013 Colorado floods is going from a very rare event to just a rare event. But then when the conditions come together, that natural variability, when we have the conditions that do make rain, there's more moisture available. And that is the trend we're seeing around the world and what's expected to continue in the future.
We saw the low pressure area spinning over the...
Nolan Doesken is Colorado's state climatologist. As he watched from his office at Colorado State University in Fort Collins, he saw a storm forming unlike anything he had seen before.
Northward and said, "Whoa, that's a really moist air mass for this time of year." And at first, the fire hose, as you might call it, was aimed at Arizona, westernmost New Mexico, and western Colorado. They sent me an email and said, "What do you think about this?" And I said, "Whoa, that's amazing." So already by Wednesday night, we got problems. Pouring rain throughout all of Boulder and urban flooding. And then with each passing hour, the magnitude of the water reaching the river channels growing. And then all the rivers coming out of the Front Range, foothills, and mountains, all growing. Bigger magnitude of rains than I believe we've ever seen, and we have data going back a full century, a little bit more. We don't think we've seen rains like this at those altitudes to produce anything like this. So this is like, oh, okay, we knew it was possible, but we haven't seen it happen.
What actually happened was surprising. The 1,000-year rain didn't produce a 1,000-year flood.
Whereas the flooding that resulted from the rain wasn't necessarily as unusual, although it still was quite unusual, and it depends on where you were. In Boulder Creek in Boulder, we probably didn't even experience what the estimated 100-year flood is. But in other creeks to our north, especially the St. Vrain drainage and the Big Thompson River, they probably saw a flood that was a little bit more unusual than Boulder saw. And the reason is the rain is just one component. Flooding involves two sciences. There's the science of meteorology, that's the rainfall, and the science of hydrology, which is what happens to that water once it's on the ground. And that's just as important as the rain.
Lessons learned from earlier floods meant Boulder and some other mountain towns had made adjustments to streets, sewers, and riversides that allowed the 1,000-year rain to dissipate into a 100-year or even a 50-year flood.
Well, the terminology 100-year and 1,000-year event is confusing, and it's also a little bit misleading. There's a lot of people, when they hear something like a 100-year flood, they think, well, if we just had one, we don't have to worry for another 100 years. A 100-year flood is a flood that has the 1% chance, 1 in 100 chance in any given year of happening.
Another element is at play. Because of climate change, the so-called 100-year flood may happen more frequently.
Then our estimates of what the 100-year return period are might not be accurate anymore. There might be a higher return frequency than what our statistics show.
Thank you to iNews' Joe Mahoney and Laura Frank for that report. And with me now is Bruce Holloman, State Coordinating Officer for this flood disaster. So what are you doing right now? The governor has appointed you the coordinating officer for the disaster. What does that entail?
Well, my main duties center about integrating the federal capabilities that the Federal Emergency Management Agency is bringing to the state, integrating those capabilities with the state agencies, and then providing those to local governments at the county and municipal level to help them first respond to and then recover from this crisis.
So you are also dealing directly with homeowners and business owners who are making claims?
Yes, our agencies deal directly with the citizens. FEMA has a good program for individual assistance. In fact, I think we have up to upwards of 26,000 individuals that have contacted FEMA and registered. And
how about the government shutdown? Is that getting in the way of this FEMA help?
No, not for the most part. The disaster has been funded, so all the agencies from FEMA and the funds necessary to support the individual households program and the public assistance program has been funded. We have seen some impacts in the availability of some other technical expertise from agencies such as the Natural Resource Conservation Service, NRCS. But other than that, we're still operating.
I mentioned the state legislative committee that has been put together to study all of this. Just from your experience so far, what you're noting as you go about dealing with this disaster, what are the things you would have this legislative committee look at?
Well, I think there's definitely some issues with how we fund disaster situations, issues in some of our laws somewhat centered around Tabor and how it allows or restricts the ability for us to provide financial assistance from different levels of government. That probably needs to be looked at and clarified. Additionally, we may want to look at some provisions in the State's Disaster Act and make sure that those are clear and understood and adequate to what we've seen.
When you say Tabor is restricting some funding, what do you mean? How does that have a bearing here?
Well, it's not that it's restricting funding, but Tabor has rules on how money is handled. And so when one level of government grants another level of government funding, the question arises, is that income under the Tabor Act to that jurisdiction or not for disaster purposes? And what we're seeing is that there's a lot of uncertainty in what the answer to that is. So people much more qualified than I are looking at those issues. Aspects of this disaster are going to be with us for a couple of years in this rebuilding process. Some of the infrastructure rebuild is going to take a long time, possibly up to 2 years to restore everything that we've lost in this disaster.
Are you worried about what's ahead? Do you feel as though everyone who's been affected by it can be made whole again?
Well, the government's not going to make anybody whole. We're going to do everything that we can to help people, to help them get back on their feet and help these communities rebuild. Everybody owns part of this, and so we're all going to have to work together. We've got a good partnership with FEMA and the federal government. We've got a good partnership with our local governments, and we'll be successful.
Thank you, Bruce Holloman. Some interesting facts behind the scenes here tonight. And among the hardest hit areas in Colorado, as we know, Estes Park, where the famous tourist attraction suffered major damage to roads and infrastructure. For weeks, the town has been working hard to clean up and try to salvage at least part of the fall tourist season. And then came that unwelcome news of the federal government shutdown. Reporter Steve Mort was in Estes Park this week and gives us this update.
Floodwaters that swept through Estes Park a month ago damaged hundreds of buildings and destroyed the two main roads that led into town. The sewage system was so broken that a third of the residents still use porta potties that have been set up throughout the neighborhoods. In spite of all of that, residents here have been working around the clock to get their town back in shape for the throngs of tourists who come every year to view the spectacular fall colors. Estes, the gateway to the Rocky Mountain National Park, draws more than 3 million visitors a year. The town of around 6,000 people depends on the park for its livelihood, and residents were hopeful that a strong October tourist season could help with their financial recovery. They managed to get 90% of their shops and restaurants back open. And then came the government shutdown.
65% of our revenue comes from tourism dollars, and about 45% of the jobs here in town are based on tourism dollars. We're already seeing some businesses having to lay some folks off because of that, and it's a combination of the flood, the roads being closed, and then the park being closed. Again, it's a double whammy that is really hard to handle.
They're not listed that way, so that's what I have.
Tricia Jacobs considers herself one of the lucky ones. She and her husband manage Kirk's fly fishing shop on Elkhorn Avenue in downtown Estes. The store suffered only minor damage, but news of the flood caused many fishing trips to be cancelled and some employees to be laid off. The closure of the park has meant even more cancellations.
A lot of us feel like we were down as was, and then somebody just kicked us while we were down. They took everything away from us by closing the park. You know, last week we had fewer people, but there were still people in town. This week, it's just way different. I mean, hardly anybody.
And Jacob says those who do come are confused, especially tourists from abroad.
The Europeans don't understand why, with the disagreement in Washington, why they would shut down the parks. And I have to say that even the Americans don't understand it because those parks are for us.
Julie Pieper is one of those who's been vexed by the closure. She and her husband own 2 restaurants in Estes that were heavily flood damaged. They're racing to reopen one this weekend to take advantage of the fall season. She says the closure of the park has been more than just a financial setback for small businesses and for the 200 park employees who've been furloughed. It's been an emotional blow.
The day the park closed down, I think everybody kind of had a little mini meltdown because that was the place we could all go to get away from debris and to get away from the reality of mold and wet carpet. And you could get outside and you could blow off a little steam, and we can't do that now. And that's been hard.
The one thing that hasn't yet been affected by the government shutdown is emergency disaster aid from federal agencies.
Okay, that sounds great.
FEMA still has more than 1,000 workers on the ground in Colorado. And 150 Colorado National Guardsmen who were to be furloughed were kept on the job last week when Governor John Hickenlooper announced he'd use state money to pay for them. It's likely to cost more than $50,000 a day. The Guardsmen are working with the state Department of Transportation to repair the numerous roads and highways that were damaged in the flood. Estes Park administrators say they're grateful that help is continuing, but say it's hard to move forward with long-term planning when federal agencies like the Army Corps of Engineers and the Forest Service are shut down.
The emergency is taken care of. The FEMA folks are here. We have Coast Guard people here helping us with hazardous waste problems. But when it comes down to the ongoing recovery and getting back on our feet, the folks that we need to help aren't working. They've been furloughed.
Governor Hickenlooper hopes to help with that process. He's applied for waivers to allow state workers to carry out some of the duties of furloughed federal workers until the shutdown's been resolved. For Colorado State of Mind, I'm Steve Morton, Estes Park.
The summer of 2013 brought not only this record flooding, but another new record for damage caused by wildland fires in Colorado and in other western states like Arizona, where a team of hotshot firefighters were all killed outside Yarnell, Arizona in July. That's when we talked with writer Michael Kotis, a freelance journalist from Boulder who has covered firefighters and trained as a firefighter for 10 years and who is now working on a book about mega fires. iNews reporter Kevin Vaughn was with us in that discussion, and also from the Wildland Fire Science Laboratory at Colorado State University, Dr. Monique Rocca, who teaches forest management and fire ecology. Kotis had just returned from the Arizona fire, and he told us there is little doubt among those who study and fight the wildland fires that climate change is a major factor in why they've become more intense.
A report came out recently from Climate Central to show that that state is warming faster than any other state in the United States. And the warming and drying of the West is having a great impact on these fires. And when you've got an overfueled forest, you've got in effect, some of these forests are slums of trees. They're so overcrowded that the trees themselves have to fight for nutrients, they have to fight for sunlight, and they have to fight for water. And if there's a drought in that forest, they're going to be that much more unhealthy and that much more prone to burn.
I just think of it this way. By some estimates, big swaths of the western forest today have 10 times as many trees per acre as they had a century ago. And so even if we weren't warming, even if we weren't in drought, you might have 100 trees fighting for the same amount of water that 10 trees that used to nourish 10 trees. So
that's a good way of thinking of it.
I'm not a scientist, but that just seems logical to me that you're going to have trees, fighting for more trees fighting for the same or now less water, and I believe that has to have an impact. I'm sure you could address that a little bit.
Competition between trees for resources is one thing that can contribute to bark beetle outbreaks, for example. The trees are weaker when there's a lot of competition, and that makes them less able to use their natural defenses to repel the bark beetle.
So, Michael, you wrote in a piece this week that I saw in Bloomberg that we should stop fighting the fires, just let them burn?
Well, there's certainly been a push for a couple of decades for let it burn policies. Now, those are policies that generally are applied to more remote forests, and we're talking about wilderness areas usually. And last May, the Forest Service circulated a memo that basically encouraged suppressing all fires, and that really outraged a lot of fire ecologists, both in and outside the Forest Service, because they really saw it as backtracking on a couple decades of policy that has shown really good effects. Last year in the Gila Wilderness in New Mexico, they had the largest fire in New Mexico's history. But if you go to that area where those fires burned, where they let previous fires burn, the really big fire last year dropped to the ground. It was far less damaging. It did far less. It had far fewer impacts on the overall health of the forest. So there's other places like the Selway Wilderness and the Bob Marshall Wilderness in Montana where they've really seen a positive effect of letting fires burn. Obviously, you can't really do that when you're adjacent to communities, and so I think one of the big pushes now is to try to use our suppression resources and our forest health resources in areas close to infrastructure and homes that we want to protect, and let fires that are farther away from those places burn.
Monique, this federal policy has, Kevin mentioned earlier that for 100 years it was one thing. Is it slowly changing and evolving?
And until this setback with the Forest Service suppressing all fires, I think we were headed in the right direction. Recent fire policy has given incident managers more flexibility on how to fight any particular fire. They can let part of the fire burn up to a ridgetop, for example, and protect a different side of the fire. There's we were moving towards a policy in which we allowed more fire, or we could use fire for resource benefit and remove the distinction between fires that must be completely suppressed and fires that might be allowed to burn. So, and we also have stopped, I believe, putting firefighters in the way, we have stopped putting firefighters out in front of fires to protect wilderness. And I think that's a big improvement. I mean, that's happened over the last several decades. So now when firefighters are getting into trouble and fire tragedies tend to be linked to protecting homes and communities.
Yeah, I think it's really important to point out that the hotshots who died in Arizona were part of a city fire department in Prescott, so they were within 30 miles of where this fire was burning. There were homes threatened. It's highly likely that some of these firefighters knew people in that community, and that probably drove them to maybe respond with more urgency and determination than they were even already known for. And there's a growing recognition that in that piece in Bloomberg, in fact, I wrote about the fact that now when you get trained for wildland firefighting, you get trained for what to do if you encounter a meth lab in the woods or a marijuana grow or an illegal waste dump. So there's an increasing recognition that forest firefighters are having to deal with urban problems because they're having to fight more and more fires that are in the wildland-urban interface, and that's presenting them with far more peril than they used to have to deal with.
I think we've also seen in this state in the last year a reality that surprised a lot of people, which is that man cannot control all fire. We saw it in Waldo Canyon last July, and we saw it in Black Forest last month. The firefighters in a lot of cases were helpless to do anything but stand there and watch the fire just devour home after home after home, because the force of nature, the force of those flames was so great. They just couldn't stop it. Somebody that I talked to for the story that we just ran made the point that we've sort of gotten this mindset that we can control the environment. We go out on a 100-degree day and we flick on our air conditioner in our car and we're cool and comfortable. But some of these fires are so intense and so incredible that man is basically powerless to do much about them.
Yeah, it's important to point out, and I don't think everybody in Colorado realizes that we've now broken our most destructive fire record in Colorado, destructive of property, 4 times in 4 years. It does seem to be that we're seeing almost an exponential increase in the severity of these fires, and at each one of those fires, and at probably a dozen others that I visited in my research, you hear the same thing from the incident commanders. We're seeing fire behavior we've never seen before, and we're having to pull firefighters off because we just don't know what this fire is going to do.
And climate change is something they point to, or is it just too complicated to say that?
No, I think they definitely point to climate change as being one of the drivers of this, and forest health, as we've discussed, being another one of the drivers. But I think the one thing that really has really complicated things for these men is the fact that there is so much more to protect in the wildland-urban interface. There are more houses, there's more infrastructure. We have watersheds that are severely threatened by these wildfires. All of the water in Denver is at risk at times from wildfires that burn up in the mountains.
Well, how do we move from the situation where firefighters have to protect all this infrastructure to some kind of different future? What would that different future be, and how would we get there?
Good question.
That's the $64,000 question that I don't have the answer for.
No.
Well, I mean, honestly, I can say that having covered these fires in Colorado for 25 years now. People have been talking for all that time about the ways that homes should be constructed that are in the red zone, and it used to be there was a big push to get rid of shake shingles, and that's gone pretty far. But I'm still just shocked to go into the woods today of the forested Front Range and see lodgepole or pine trees and stuff right up against people's decks, branches up under the eaves of their home, their firewood pile nice stacked up underneath their elevated deck. I mean, all of that stuff is the kind of stuff that drives the destruction in in these wildfires, and it's I mean, completely changing that is going to take a long time, I think, if it hasn't changed by now.
And whose responsibility is that? Is that a city or a county's responsibility to go to these homeowners and say, this is not acceptable?
Well, it probably should be those entities and others. You know, the insurance industry should be involved in this. Government should be involved in this. But it's pretty hard to address this many homes up in the mountains and change pretty big cultural attitudes. I still interview people all the time in really hazardous fire situations who will respond when you ask, why haven't you created a defensible space around your house? Why haven't you limbed up your trees? These aren't very hard things to do. And they will always say, well, we moved to the mountains for the trees, so we don't want to cut down, the trees that we came here to be able to look at.
So they want to live in this natural setting and they accept the risk?
They do, but one thing that a fire scientist pointed out to me years ago when I started working on this is that those people who move there for the trees and think that they are living in this natural environment are living actually in a very unnatural forest when you're in these forests that have 10 times more trees than they're supposed to have. And we've culturally begun to see these overgrown ponderosa pine forests as the way a ponderosa pine forest is supposed to look. And a lot of these people, if you were to take them to some of these forests, like there are a number near Fort Collins that actually have been thinned out really effectively and said, well, this is the forest, the way it should look, they wouldn't be as interested in living in it.
Thank you to Michael Kotis, Monique Rocca, and Kevin Vaughn talking here in July. Thanks as well to Bruce Holloman in our earlier segment on flood recovery. And that is Colorado State of Mind for this week. You may see the program again at video.rmpbs.org. Next week, State Attorney General John Suthers and former Congressman David Skaggs with their opposing arguments on whether the Taxpayers' Bill of Rights should be ruled unconstitutional. I'm Cynthia Hessin. Join us then for another edition of Colorado State of Mind. Good night.